forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman, and this show is brought to you by CartKing.com. Everybody loves CartKing.com. You go to cart-king.com. Their phone number is 877-986-7771. You give them a call, you tell them Ed Opperman sent you, get a good deal. Have you ever thought about opening your own mobile cart or kiosk business? Perhaps your current business wants to add multiple point-of-sale locations across the country quickly. Maybe the facility you manage right now could increase revenue by adding coffee, food, or retail services. And let's say you have a factory or a warehouse or a motel or something like that. Put a little coffee cart in the lobby there. CartKing.com could be the answer to your needs. CartKing.com is a North American designer and manufacturer of the finest mobile retail, coffee, and food kiosks that money can buy. For 20 years, CartKing.com has been working with clients and corporations across America to provide indoor and outdoor carts and kiosks for any application. Go to the website, cart-king.com. You check out their different designs. You pick one out. They help you custom design it for you. They build it, and then they ship it worldwide. CartKing.com, 877-986-7771. We have today a returning guest, a much appreciated guest, Professor Richard B. Spence from the University of Idaho. You can check out his website over there, idaho.edu. Author of many, many books, Wall Street and the Russian Revolution from 1905 to 1925. We just had him on recently. You could look him up. And we talked about that. And we also talked about Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence and the Occult, Trust No One, The Secret World of Sidney Riley. And I guess that's about it, right? Okay. Dr. Spence. Are you a doctor? Do I call you Dr. Spence?
You can call me Dr. Spence, or you can just call me Rick. That's fine.
Okay, or Rick. Hey, are you one of those doctors can write a prescription? Because I got a real hassle going on over here with my doctor.
No, unfortunately, I am not a real doctor. Well, I am, yeah. not a medical.
Yes, I need the kind that can write me a prescription. That's what I need right now. I know. Dr. Rick Spence, though, tell us about yourself. Remind the audience about yourself.
Well, let's see. I'm a professor of history at the University of Idaho. Northern part of the state in Moscow, Idaho. I've been here for almost 33 years teaching at the university, and I teach a wide variety of courses. My particular interest, the thing that kind of really gets me going, is modern Russian history, especially things dealing with the Russian Revolution. Book Wall Street and the Russian Revolution. But I'm also interested, or have become interested in a variety of things. Military history is interesting to me. History of anti-Semitism, which we're going to talk about today, cult, of secret societies. One of the things that I teach here at this university is a course on the role of conspiracies and secret societies in history. And in fact, it's a very popular course, more popular than I assumed. That's probably the reason I get away with teaching it. It's enough students to it. So these are all things that seem like they're going in different directions, but the interesting thing about all those kinds of things is they often tend to come, and that's true for anti-Semitism as well.
I tell you, we're just hearing you talk. It reminds me of the last show. I enjoyed sitting back and listening. I wish I was a student in your class. I really do. I wish you lived closer. I wish you lived closer. I can go up there and take a class. So the history of anti-Semitism, what can you teach?
Well, maybe the place to begin is with the word itself, anti-Semitism. And that's the term which is commonly used today. So one of the things maybe to point out is that anti-Semitism is not a very old term. In fact, it's about 130, maybe 140 years old. It really goes back to around 1880. So if you go back prior to the 1880s, you're not going to find anti-Semitism. It wasn't yet in use, and it had to be invented. Who was it invented by? Well, there's always an inventor. And so the fellow who around 1879, 1880 came up with the term antisemitismus, which it is in German because he was a German, was a fellow by the name of Wilhelm Marr, M-A-R. Marr's kind of an interesting guy. He was, for most of his career, a journalist. He was the son of an actor. He was born in the early 19th century, around 1819, 1820, lived until the early 20th century, so lives rather long. And what he, the reason why he came up with the term Antisemitismus in around 1880 was he wanted to replace older terms that were in use, particularly one which in German was Judenhass. That's the term he wanted to replace. Judenhass basically just translates to Jew hate. And being that Marr considered himself to be a modern, educated man of the 19th century, he thought that Jew hate was really a kind of archaic and inaccurate term, and he wanted to come up with something that was more scientific. And so this artificial term that he invented, Antisemitismus, was his replacement for what he thought was a kind of crude and inaccurate term, was something going to become more, that would be more within the realm of the modern. And now here's the interesting, so what this boils down to is that the term anti-Semitic is invented by an anti-Semite. Okay? Does that make any particular sense? That's where the origin comes from. It wasn't a term that was developed by someone trying to explain a movement. It was from the outside. It was someone who was trying to come up with this term in. But the story gets even more interesting because Wilhelm Marr, I've described him as a German, and he lived in Germany, both before and after it was unified into a single country. Marr is himself at least partly of Jewish ancestry. And it's one of those things that seems to become increasingly obscured as time goes on for reasons you might be able to imagine. But it brings up, in Marr himself, you have someone who is, there are arguments here. One argument is that his mother was Jewish, other that his father was Jewish or partly Jewish. At least Marr's wives were Jewish. He worked for a number of Jewish employers during his lifetime, both journalists elsewhere. So the type of thing here is that Marr wasn't someone who was unacquainted with Jews and was in some ways a kind of, at least kind of marginal member of that community itself. We'll come back to him in a minute to kind of to place Marr and Jews in Germany and in the whole society of 19th century Europe to get an idea as to how it appears. So Marr was one of the reasons he wanted to come up with this new term of anti-Semitism opposed to Jew hate, because he thought that Jew hate just really didn't describe what was going on. And he thought that, simplest way to put it is that Marr thought that Jews were a bad influence on German and other European societies. He didn't think that all Jews were necessarily bad or couldn't be reformed in some ways, but he felt that the whole sort of his emphasis, this is something that crops up later in the Nazis, remember, is that Jews epitomized some kind of mindset, some sort of internalized moral code that was just at odds with the larger society around them, and therefore they represented kind of corrosive influence that had to be eliminated. And this was something that Marr, beginning again around the 1870s and 1880s, thought it was his mission in life to promote. So he began writing a whole series of tracts, laying out his basic program that Jews, even assimilated Jews, in fact, especially assimilated, that is, Jews who blended in with the society around them. Jews, for instance, that might in fact leave any kind of religious practice, for whom became part of an ancestral inheritance, who otherwise embraced the identity of being Germans. Well, from Marr's standpoint, in other words, people like him, if you think about it, Marr's argument was that these were even more dangerous in a way because they carried with them this kind of bad influence, and that therefore assimilation wasn't a way of solving the so-called Jewish problem. Assimilation was really a kind of infiltration. Assimilated Jews, those Jews who basically looked and behaved, and for the most part, other Germans, were a greater danger to society than those who maintained separate cultural existence. Say, let's say the staunchly Orthodox maintained general culture of separation, distinction in dress, in speech, and activities. Those he thought were sort of more compartmentalized in some way.
And what was his complaint, though? What was his complaint about Jews?
Well, Marr's complaint is one that's echoed in a number of other cases, and I could throw in how many. I think you and many of your listeners may have heard of a composer by the name of Richard Wagner.
Sure.
Whole Rhine cycle, women with spears and horned helmets shouting. All right, clearly I'm not an opera fan, but at any rate, the whole sort of Wagnerian opera of the Ride of the Valkyries. Richard Wagner was a 19th century German, whose mission in life that he eventually found was to come up with what he believed to be a national music of the German people. That's what all of the Wagnerian operas are about. They're a musical version of a kind of German national myth that really has German people. It was invented to sort of give Germans something that they could all kind of believe in or think they were a part of. And it comes back to, well, I mentioned earlier, you have to fit all of this stuff. You have to fit Marr and Wagner know each other. They're connected to each other. So Wagner's idea, Wagner believed that there needed to be a specifically German music, but he also became convinced that Jewish composers, Mahler, really couldn't fit in. That Jews simply couldn't compose German music because they weren't Germans. So to try to make sense out of this attitude, remember, we're talking about the 1800s. And one of the things that happens in Germany, and I want to make it clear that anti-Semitism and these attitudes I'm talking about are not exclusively German. France and Italy and Spain, and especially in Russia, you can find them in America. But for the moment, let's just focus on Germany. So one of the problems in Germany in the 19th century was figuring out what Germans were and how to organize them. So at the beginning of the 19th century, Germany, geographic expression, there is no German state. There's this area in the central part of Europe that's full of all of these little countries. And there's Prussia, and there's Bavaria, and there's Württemberg, and there's Thuringia, and then there's Austria, which is next door. There are dozens of German states, large and small. So Germans don't inhabit a single country, and they don't have a single nationality. Now that changed in 1870. Now notice I said that Marr comes up, invents his term of anti-Semitism 10 years later. And in 1870, what happens is that the German Empire is, and through that process, Germany appears on the map for the first time in history as a political state. Now, let's not say that all the Germans are into it. Germans in the Austrian Empire next door, people like future Adolf Hitler, are not citizens of this German empire, but most Germans are. But what you're trying to do, what you had to kind of do overnight, was to combine all of these different states, and in the southern part of Germany, people tended to be Catholic, and they had a particular kind of culture. You can still see it today. If you go to Germany today and you go to Munich, which is in Bavaria in the south, and you go to Berlin or Hamburg in the north, it's not the same Germany. There are different regionalized cultures. And I might say that in the 19th century, those distinctions were much clearer because there's, particularly since World War II, there's been a large mixing of populations with one area to another. So the problem here, when you sort of unify all of these areas that are kind of loosely connected by language. I mean, the whole thing was that in 1870, what really connected Germans together? Religion? No. The kings or princes they had? No. Even history in many cases? No. Arguably, they all sort of spoke different dialects of the same language. And that point is true. The German spoken in Bavaria, the same as the German spoken in Berlin. German spoken in the eastern part of the empire wasn't the same as that spoken in the Rhine. So this is why you had a whole variety of intellectuals, or people who thought they were intellectuals, including Marr and Wagner and others, who saw a need to create some kind of common German culture, to invent an identity. And this is one of those things that's true for really all nationalism. You need to invent an identity. Now, by the way, there's a counterpart later on in a very different context when in 1948 the State of Israel is. And in Israel, in 1948, in the years following, you were bringing in Jewish populations from Eastern Europe, from the Middle East, from different areas, different languages, practicing different forms of the religion, or not practicing Judaism at all. That is, you had people who were atheists, agnostics, Orthodox, and everything in between. And there again, the problem was, how did you create a single nation and a national idea out of people who really only shared a limited number of things in common? By the way, and that's an ongoing question in Israel today in terms of the different constituencies within it. Part of any kind of nation building is you have to invent what an Israeli is. You have to invent what an Italian or a German would be under those circumstances. You have to come up with these things that otherwise are kind of lacking. So remember, in this period after 1870, the big kind of intellectual furor in Germany was determining who were German, what Germans were, and that meant you had to decide what Germans were, they were not. And then you had to encounter that there was within this new German state and within German areas of Central Europe, there was a kind of minority. And the minority we're talking about were the Jews, and they're not very numerous. So let's say if you go, let's say, to Germany in the early part of the 20th century, German Empire around 19 had a population of around 65 million people. Out of that 65 million people, only about half of them, less than 1% of the population, are Jews. I think that's a very important point to keep in mind. Jews everywhere in Europe, whether it was in Poland or whether it was in Russia, Germany, England, or elsewhere, are always a minority of one size or another, and generally a fairly small one. So in Germany, Jews are less than 1% of the population. And furthermore, they also tend to be generally assimilated. So one of the things that it's one of those things that the Holocaust and the Second World War sort of changes our perspective. And because of those events, there can be the assumption that the relationship between Jews and the larger German society had always been hostile. And that's not really true. I mean, if you go back, again, in early 20th century, the two countries in Europe in which Jews were the most assimilated, generally speaking, the most accepted, were Britain and Germany. German Jews were quite successful for the most part. They were generally people who were in the professions, largely because they had never been landowners and members of the aristocracy. I mean, although some of them were. Jews, as far back as the 18th century, had been ennobled. There had been it's one of those, the outgrowth of something that we call, the Enlightenment of the 18th century, that era of the French Revolution and the American Revolutions and kind of philosophical underpinnings of democracy came out. So if you go back to that period, there was this whole period of enlightenment. One of the questions that came up in the 1700s, again, throughout Europe is, well, what are these Jews living amongst us? I mean, are they Frenchmen? Are they Italians? Are they a separate nationality? Or are they just some kind of version of a larger nationality? So all of those questions were kind of working themselves out. And among Jews themselves, that raised question, I mean, what are we? What are we? Okay, we've, my family's lived in Germany or in Poland for the last 500 years or 1,000 years. I mean, now we speak German. The only thing that tends to separate us from the other people around us are our religious practices. And so if I did those religious practices, am I now a German? What would it take? Is a Jewish identity completely incompatible with German identity or an English or French identity? Are we a separate nation living within another nation, or are we simply a kind of religious sect of Germans or English or French? Maybe this can go, and much of it depends upon what kind of identity you have. And it comes back to this, that national identity, like personal identity in many ways, fundamentally comes down to what you believe you are or what you want to be in those respects. And that's why I think Wilhelm Marr is an interesting character in this, and it's then kind of understandable, or at least you can appreciate why he's thinking, why Marr thinks he has to come up with some sort of pseudo-scientific term to describe Jewish distinctiveness, because it's a problem he's thinking about himself. Remember, Marr himself is partly of Jewish ancestry, which means if I'm partly of Jewish ancestry, Jew, is it German? Where am I?
Well, let me ask you something.
Yeah,
is that
sure.
unique to Jews? That is it a race? Is it a religion? Is that unique to Jews, or is there Muslims, or is there anybody else that has that going on?
Well, the term unique is kind of tricky.
Okay.
I think it's one of those things that you find. I'm not sure you couldn't find the same thing among other groups, but Jews in Europe, particularly in this period, occupied this kind of, I think, niche that no other group did. And part of it had to do with the way in which they defined themselves. And there was no fundamental agreement on that either. Because one of the things is that there was no unified. I mean, the largest Jewish community in Europe in the 19th century were what were called Ashkenazi Jews, which basically means German Jews. Term those that were in some form German speaking. Generally, the form of German they spoke was what we now call Yiddish. Okay, so anybody that's a language which kind of unfortunately is dying out. The language of Jews in Europe for centuries, in Central Europe, had been Yiddish. And Yiddish is basically a medieval form of German with a certain number of Hebrew and Slavic words thrown into it. But it's fundamentally German, which means that Germans and Jews, someone speaking regular German and someone speaking Yiddish, could generally communicate. Which comes back to this point I was making, the idea that Jews and Germans were innately hostile. They actually shared much of the same culture. Remember, Jews, not just Jews in Germany, but all of the Jews, where most of the Jewish population isn't in Germany, where they're 1% of the population. It's in the Russian Empire east, territories that used to be part of Poland. So the big concentration of Jews in Europe, of Ashkenazi Jews, is in Eastern Europe, not. So in Germany, there were like 500,000. In France, there were maybe 200,000. In Britain, there were a couple of 100,000. In Portugal and Spain, there are basically none. In Italy, there may be 20 or 30,000.
Well, let me ask you this: in Russia and Poland and Britain, was there anti-Semitism there as well?
Yes. Okay. And in fact, much more than you would have found in Germany. So one of the biggest, if you go back to this period, one of the biggest kind of what's assumed to be a expression of anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic feeling is the Dreyfus case. You heard of that?
No.
The Dreyfus case broke out in France, not in Germany, not in England, not in Russia, broke out in France in 1894. And as I tell this story, parts of it will probably begin to sound familiar. Alfred Dreyfus was an army officer. And in 1894, he was accused of treason. He was accused of selling military secrets to, guess who? The Germans. Because the Germans, the way that Germany became unified was that it won a war against the French. It was the means by which the Germans were brought into the state. So the French in the 1890s regarded Germany as their national enemy. And therefore, the whole idea a French army officer would sell military secrets to the Germans, the worst they could possibly do. Now, Dreyfus, and then the fact that Dreyfus was Jewish, then raised this question. Now, the other interesting thing about it is that he's Jewish and he's also Alsatian, which was a German-speaking area in eastern France. This is going to confuse some people, but as the closer you got to the border between France and Germany, and there's still an area that's part of France today called Alsace, Alsace, Alsace. That was an area which had been part of France, but was German-speaking, and it still is. That is, if you go into that area of France next to Germany, people speak a dialect of German. It's just the way it was. And what had happened is that in that war, in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 that had led to the unification of Germany, Alsace had been annexed to the German Empire. Now, Dreyfus was from a Jewish family that came from Alsace. His family had remained French. They had lived there. But the mere fact, see, in the view of many Frenchmen, Dreyfus was two things. He was a Jew, which made him kind of questionable because is he really French? But then the other thing which is often overlooked, his family, Alsace, is German. It was a part of France which has now become part of Germany. And so it wasn't just that Dreyfus was being the animus against him was that he was Jewish. It was also that he was a German Jew, which sort of added this whole question. And there also, frankly, there was initially good reason to suspect that Dreyfus might have been a traitor. I mean, somebody was. So let's put it this way. There really was someone selling secrets to the Germans. And Dreyfus initially was a legitimate suspect. But as the investigation went on, I think basically in an effort to try to find the culprit and punish someone, he's the guy that guilt, and he is tried, convicted, and he is sent off to Devil's Island. He is exiled off to French Guiana and the penal colony there. But this begins this whole sort of ongoing legal and social question in France that plays out for years. So the Dreyfus affair it starts in 1894. It goes on and on and on with trials and retrials, accusations and counter-accusations, all the way up to 1906, when eventually Dreyfus is exonerated. That's how it eventually ends. And the reason he's exonerated is because it's eventually shown that what happened is that his military superiors, in the absence of anybody else, eventually decided this guy is guilty. They didn't really have much evidence against him. They sort of ran a kangaroo court, did him so they could claim that they had found the spy. But then when other evidence showed that it wasn't, and eventually they found out who the real spy was. But when they found out it wasn't him, they then refused to back down because that would have made it appear that the French army could make a mistake, which nobody liked. Now, this shouldn't be too strange to people. You know, you convict the wrong guy, but rather than admit that you convicted the wrong person, that you essentially railroaded, you just double down and try to insist that this is the person who's actually guilty, even though their whole case is crumbling around you. Now, that's when initially in the Dreyfus case, the fact that Dreyfus was Jewish doesn't really seem to have figured much. I mean, the more important thing as to why he was did initially probably had to do with the fact that most of his coworkers didn't like him. Now, did they like him because he was a Jew? Well, maybe some of them. Dreyfus is one of those people that, for whatever reason, personality-wise, rubbed other people the wrong way. And it's one of those things that you always have to keep in mind. It's like the old saying that the most important thing in life is who you know. The other thing that's important is who likes you and who doesn't.
Yeah, look at all the trouble he caused. Yeah.
It's really, it's one of those things initially that, the fact that Dreyfus had a number of strikes against him. Think of it this way. One, he was suspected of being a German in some way because he came from Alsace. And by the way, his name Dreyfus is German, not really French. And then he was a Jew, which really wasn't initially that important, I think. And then beyond that, he was just kind of, in the view of many people, a sort of jerk. Didn't like. So, we got to send somebody up. Let's send this. Who is it around here? Okay, we got to find a traitor. Who do we don't like? Apparently it was him. Now, but then as the case begins to change and as the evidence of Dreyfus's innocence becomes more and more obvious, and eventually he will be, the case against him is impossible to maintain, that's where the accusation is that, he's a Jew, and therefore he's not really a Frenchman. And see, this is a reason that would be kind of evidence of his guilt or his disloyalty, because we're not dealing with someone who was a legitimate Frenchman to begin with. And that, of course, begins this whole argument. Well, what's a legitimate Frenchman? How is it, is it impossible for a Jew to be truly French? Or what is it? Is it a religion, or is it a nationality? And that's one of those issues that still exists.
Let me ask you this, though. Was this common, though, with other nationalities, with other faiths, with other religions? Were people that bigoted about everything back in those days?
Well, probably by modern standards, were a lot more bigoted and open about it than they were previously. But it's a different situation because, that is, being Jewish wasn't the same thing as being Catholic or Protestant. All right, those were simply really. So there would be an agreement. Let's, to keep it simple, go back among Germans. Germans were roughly divided between Protestants in the north, Catholics in the south. So other things aside, dialect and the rest of the youth out of your Bavarian or Prussian, but Bavarians, let's put it this way, were overwhelmingly Catholic. That was part of their culture. Prussians were overwhelmingly Protestant, tended to be part of their culture. It's partly the way they identify themselves. But religion was one of those things. Being a Protestant or a Catholic, you could switch or you could abandon. That is, you could simply proclaim that you were an atheist and you would have no religion at all, which was comparatively rare. But it was one of those things that it was simply a conversion from one faith to another. But Jewishness was more complicated because I don't know, it's maybe the simplest way described is the concept of a kind of tribal that transcended the religious. So it comes back to this question: if a Jew ceases to practice Judaism, let's say if a Jew proclaims himself an atheist, or let's say converts to Catholicism, have they completely ceased to be a Jew? Are they completely severed from the community? And the traditional view of that is no, because it's not just a practice. That is, Jewishness isn't simply based upon religious practice, but upon heredity. The traditional Orthodox determination of whether or not you were a Jew was whether your mother was. It was matrilineal, which I've always found kind of interesting. Therefore, from the standpoint, generally speaking, of Orthodox, conservative, traditional Judaism, going back centuries and centuries, if not millennia, if your mother was a member of the community, if she was Jewish, then you were. But by contrast, if your father was Jewish and your mother wasn't, then no, you weren't. Didn't count that. One of my first exposures to this whole thing was in a college classroom years ago. which had two people in the class, and one fellow was a very interesting guy who was an Orthodox rabbi, and the other was a young guy, a kind of friend of mine, who considered himself Jewish, even though his father was and his mother wasn't. But he'd sort of like rediscovered his Jewish root. I was talking about it, and the fellow was just absolutely adamant. And they would say they essentially had an argument in the middle of a class over whether or not this fellow's claim to being Jewish was legitimate or not, and there are all kinds of positions in between. So there are different ways of simply determining, but there's always this element of ancestry, and it's one of those things. Now someone can become Jewish by converting. That happens. It happened over the centuries, and the same way you can convert, although it would probably be fair to say, if not necessarily official, that a convert, someone who is a fresh convert in faith, isn't exactly in the same position as someone who has been born. It is one of those things that you were born into. In most cases, it's part of a heredity which goes along. But what you're part of in this case isn't really a nation. I mean, that was what all the other Europeans are trying to do is they're trying to build nationalities. They're trying to construct these artificial models of what Germans or Russians or Poles or Italians or French. And that's what this question comes down to. In Dreyfus's case, the same thing Marr is really trying to figure out for himself, among others. Are Jews German or French? What are they? Do they constitute an alien national element? And you see, the problem with that is that there's no state. There's nothing. Remember, there's no Israel at the time. Very few Jews live anywhere near Palestine. There's just a residual population there. Where Jews mostly live is in Eastern Europe. So what have you got? Imagine most Jews, about 7 million. Remember I said about 500,000 Jews live in Germany? Empire, there are 7 million Jews, which, by the way, is still a minority because the Russian Empire has 120 million people. So while Jews are a somewhat bigger minority in the Russian Empire than they are in Germany or elsewhere, they're still a small empire. So they mostly live in the western portions of the Russian Empire, and they aren't Russians. They're not Slavs. They mostly live among Poles and Ukrainians, but they're not Poles or Ukrainians. And they adhere to their own particular religion, and they speak their own language, but their language is basically a dialect of German. So I come back to this question, what are they? Are they a religious community, or are they a cultural? And it's, Poles could connect them, even though there was no political state of Poland in this period, it's simply been divided up between the German and the Austrian and the Russian. Poles still saw themselves as part of a nation. That is, there had historically been a thing called Poland. We're living in this territory which is Poland, therefore we're Poles. But you see, Jews living in Poland can't really claim that as their country. They live, but they're not Poles. Because the country is Poland, and we're not Poles. We're Jews. We live among Poles, but we are distinct in terms of religion and language and many other aspects of culture. So, do we become Poles? And if we do that, how exactly would it be done? Jews occupied this kind of area that nobody else, I don't think any other group in Europe did, or many other groups in the world ever have. It was this question of where.
Well, let me ask you this, because I hear this all the time, because you mentioned before the Ashkenazi Jews, right? I remember that expression from New York. I've heard that before. But you hear people today, these anti-Semites today, and they'll say, well, those aren't even real Jews. Those are Khazars. Those are the bad ones, the Khazars, What the hell does that mean? Yeah.
Well, what they really say when this is the Khazar, and that's Khazar for anybody. And the Khazars were real. They were a medieval nomadic Turkic people who, before the Mongols, and then along with a whole variety of other sort of nomadic marauding tribes came in and took over what we think of today as the Ukrainian or the Russian steppes. So they sort of lived out there and they herded sheep and horses. But the Khazars were slightly more civilized than most of the others of these steppe nomads, and they actually had formed a fairly cohesive empire that lasted for a few centuries, right? But what they did, where this whole theory comes from, is that the Khazars, when they showed up, they're essentially, we know from their language that they're Turkics. I mean, not like modern Turks in Turkey. They would be related because there were a whole variety. But they spoke a Turkic language, which has nothing to do with Hebrew or German or Russian or anything else. And they found themselves sandwiched between two sort of powers. And one of them was the Christian Eastern Roman Empire. And the other was the Muslim Caliphate. Okay, and both of these were states that were very closely aligned to their religion. So the Eastern Roman Empire was Christian, was Eastern Orthodox, and Caliphate, of course, was Orthodox Muslim. And one of the few things is that while the Muslims and the Christians fought each other, one of the things they agreed upon was that anybody who wasn't a Christian or a Muslim was a heathen and therefore fair. And therefore you heathens. And thus it made the Khazars, who were trying to do business with the and the Arabs and everybody else, found that they just weren't going to get any respect unless they apparently converted one way. But there was one exception. There was one group that you could be part of that both Christians and Muslims couldn't consider to be heathens or pagans. That, of course, was a Jew. Why did they have to do that? Well, because both Christianity and Islam, the very basis of their, the various prophets which they honored, the foundations of their religion, especially in Christianity, was Judaism. And therefore, no matter how much you might disagree with it, no matter how much that Christian or Muslim theologians might argue that Jews were just sort of stubbornly resisting sensation, that you couldn't call them, they weren't heretics, because if you condemned Judaism, you were condemning the very basis that your own religion derived from. And it's one of the things that made the relationship, especially between Christianity and Judaism, complicated. But you couldn't actually deny them. So what happened is that these medieval, and I'm talking about like the 9th and 10th centuries, the rulers of the Khazars converted to Judaism. Okay? One of the few, a kind of mass conversion to Judaism, but they basically did it for political reasons. That's the general argument. Because by becoming Jews, they thereby adopted a religion that both Christians and Muslims had to give a certain amount of grudging respect. Others, you could no longer treat them. And what it really comes down to is that what Christians, Jews all sort of, hesitate to use the word agree, but what they would have to accept is that they all worship the same God, right?
Right.
All right? It's all the same God. So Allah, God, Hashem, it's all the same. They do that in very different ways, but often in using the same. So, for instance, Moses is the key prophetic figure in Judaism. Moses is a very important prophet in Islam. And, of course, Moses is a very important prophetic figure in Christianity. So there's much they can agree on, and then there's also much to fight over. So what the Khazars did was a pretty clever political ploy. And they adopted a religion that the Muslims and Christians had to begrudgingly respect. This is the key point, but which didn't place them under any kind of obligation or control of Muslim or Christian rulers. So here was the problem. Had become Muslims, it would then immediately make them subject to the head of the Muslim caliphate, the Caliph in Baghdad. Suddenly, by becoming Muslims, you'd now given this guy some kind of authority over. In the same way that if you became Orthodox Christians, you had immediately given the Patriarch in Constantinople authority over. by becoming Jews, you adopted a Christians and Muslims had to basically respect to some degree, but which gave them no authority. So there was this kind of quasi-Jewish state. Remember, a state composed of people who weren't Jews, but essentially were Turks who had converted to Judaism for political reasons. And then the question becomes, what happens to the Khazars? Well, like all empires, it eventually collapses. Khazars kind of disappear from history. And then later, you get this theory that really crops up pretty much in the 20th century that, well, where did all of these Eastern European Jews come from? Where did the Ashkenazi Jews come from? Well, the argument became the nearest proximate case where we know there were a large number of Jews in the Middle Ages were the Khazars, so they must all be, or most of them, nobody really says all, most of them must be the descendants of the Khazars, see? But then you get this argument, because they're the descendants of the Khazars, they're not really Jews. So people who are arguing from the standpoint of many modern anti-Semites, what they're trying to do is they're trying to delegitimize the whole idea that Russian and Polish Jews, the great mass of the Jewish population in Europe, weren't really Jews. This is always kind of weird. It means that if you're attacking somebody for being Jewish, and then their next argument is that they're not really Jews, I don't. What's your problem here?
A little of both. You got to come on both sides.
I mean, the real goal in this, you have to look at what the goal of it is to simply delegitimize these people. In other words, to argue that they're not what it is that. And in a way, it goes back to this thing with the Khazars. If you can suddenly argue that Jews aren't really Jews, then they have no connection to the Hebrews of the Old Testament, and therefore they're just a bunch of fakers and the descendants of some kind of medieval marauding steppe nomads, and therefore we don't have to give them any respect, and we don't have to accept them as having anything to do with us. They're imposters.
Now, I have one more topic I want to cover with you, and if we go over time, we'll just go over time.
Okay.
What about the whole thing about the protocols of the Elders of Zion?
The protocols of the Elders of Zion. Well, now, man, the protocols of the Elders of Zion is probably one of the most effective and insidious hoaxes, which is, and even though it has been repeatedly demonstrated to be pretty much as a work of fake, it's not too difficult to tell where it was derived from. Who developed it, and precisely why isn't entirely clear. So here's very roughly the story. In the early 20th century, beginning in Russia, in the Russian Empire, where there was a very, very strong element of official anti-Semitism. So while we should go back to say that while in France and in Germany there were manifestations of anti-Semitism, politically it wasn't important. There weren't any substantial anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish political parties within those countries, and it wasn't a widely held opinion, kind of a fringe opinion. And the government gave no support to it. There was nothing in the government of the Kaiser or the Third Republic that in any way sort of supported anti-Semitic ideas. Jews were generally quite well accepted in the higher levels. In Russia, it was different. In Russia, the Tsarist state itself passed laws that had a whole variety of kind of economic and social harassments. And these were really designed to essentially compel people to convert and assimilate. By simply making it so onerous, so difficult to simply do business as an avowed Jew, you would just give up on that and become a Russian, the whole idea. So there was a kind of an official anti-Semitism there. So the Russian government and much of Russian society was quite open to this. So this work emerges, and it's called the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. And what it basically purports to tell is a plan for world domination. Okay, so you ever run across this idea that Jews want to rule the world, or better yet, actually rule it?
Yeah.
Well, here you go. This is supposedly the blueprint for how that's achieved. Now, the first place is, by the way, there are lots of different version protocols. And in fact, there are like 20 different slight permutations on this. They all tell basically the same story, but they're slightly different in length, or how many protocols or how many chapters there are, and the wording kind of varies. But the first place it appears is in an obscure Russian newspaper in St. Petersburg in 1903. That is, it does not appear as a book. It appears as a kind of serialized series of articles in a newspaper. And it's a small newspaper called Znamya, it means the banner, and it's published by people who were, well, anti-Semites. What a surprise. They tended to be part of a Russian, again, a kind of fringe political movement which was trying to defend what they saw was true Russian identity. And so this was published. Now, the interesting thing about the initial version protocol, always important if you're examining things in history, go back to the beginning to sort of back engineer things to when they actually started, because often when you get there, you find something different than what comes along later. In the initial version of the protocols, and even in later ones, Jews are rarely mentioned. I mean, it doesn't really come up. What are mentioned all the time, if you were to look through these, what comes up more often than Jews are Freemasons. And I want to make it clear, I'm not starting to pick on the Freemasons. That's what it's about. So what this whole thing purports to describe, if anybody actually reads it, and especially in its original version, is that it describes what is fundamentally a Judeo-Masonic or Masonic for world dominance, in which Jews are kind of roped in some ways. And there are other things that if you read through, nothing to do with Judaism in particular. I mean, to me, it's unclear. What I think the whole thing was, is I think all of this started with something that somebody concocted. And you can see the ways in which they sort of put it together just like a recipe. They borrowed a little bit here and a little bit there. But what it's mostly based was anti-Masonic conspiracy theories from around the 1880s and 1890s, which were very common. And then it was just kind of adapted. You just kind of throw Jews into it, and then over time, with each kind of re-editing, the Jewish element became more and more apparent, and the Masonic element is kind of – but it just depends upon what order of word you want to put in. I mean, what you could do with the protocols, you could take the protocols and you could take out any references, Masons or anything that sounds like Jews, and you could stick in whatever you wanted to. You could stick in WASPs, Mexicans, Lithuanians, put it into a conspiracy of any of those groups.
Well, let me ask you a question then. How can someone find the earliest version of this and read it for themselves and come to their own conclusions?
Well, one of the places, if you're really interested in the protocols, what you need to do is to find a book called The Non-Existent Manuscript. And it is the author of it is an Italian by the name, his name is Cesare Caesar. It's C-E-S-A-R-E, De Michaelis. And then basically Michael with an I-S on it. But if you simply look up the non-existent manuscript, you'll find his name spelled correct. It's not. I warn you that it is not terribly scintillating reading. It was much better in the original Italian than it is in English. That he has taken this and he did this whole thing of back engineering it. He's tried to reconstruct what he thinks was the kind of a script or how these came together. One of the things you'll often find in modern discussions of the protocols is the common statement is that it is a forgery based upon an earlier work called Dialogues in Hell between Machiavelli and Montesquieu. All right? And to some degree it is, but you can get this impression, and what that was, it was a political tract written some decades earlier, like 1860s and 1870s, had nothing to do with Jews. It had to do with French politics. But there are elements of it.
Let me ask you a question. Would you like to cover what went on in Nazi Germany in another hour?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, then let's put the commercial break here.
Okay.
And we'll be back with more of Professor Richard Spence. Fascinating discussion here. There's just so much here. Several books he's written. One is Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence and the Occult. We have a previous show with that title. You can go look it up. Trust No One, The Secret World of Sidney Riley. And today we're discussing anti-Semitism in World War II. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the Ashkenazis, the Hazaras, all this stuff you hear people talking about all the time. And we didn't get into the globalists. You hear that phrase all the time these days, globalist this, globalist that, which just seems to be a code word. So we'll be right back with more of a Professor Richard Spence after these messages. And now a word from our sponsors. Check out CartKing.com, 877-986-7771. Have you ever thought about opening your own mobile cart or kiosk business? Perhaps your current business wants to add multiple point-of-sale locations across the country quickly. Maybe the facility you manage could kickstart revenue by adding coffee, food, or retail services, like let's say you own an office building or a warehouse. Put one of these carts there in the lobby. Well, CartKing.com can be the answer to your needs. CartKing.com is a North American designer and manufacturer of the finest mobile retail coffee and food carts and kiosks money can buy. For 20 years, CartKing.com has been working with clients and corporations across America to provide indoor and outdoor carts and kiosks for any application. From large, heated, and secure outdoor retail or food kiosks to smaller, more mobile coffee kiosks or coffee stations, coffee carts, CartKing.com designs and builds them all. Carts and kiosks are fun, and so are the dozens of designs on the website, CartKing.com. Please visit today at CartKing.com or just call them at 877-986-7771. Tell them Ed Opperman sent you and you get a good deal. The Opperman Report is brought to you by SubhashTechnosis.com. Subash Technosis is a search engine optimization and website design company. They're located in India, so you know you're going to save a lot of money and get top quality service. They offer all sorts of business process outsourcing, data entry, banking BPO services, recruitment process outsourcing, software testing, offshoring, research network, customer care, press release, content writing and distribution, and much, much more. Now you can get a hold of Subash Technosis by email at info@subhashtechnosis.com. Their website is www.subhashtechnosis.com, and their Skype is ANUSHASUBASH. Remember, all these shows on Awake are brought to you by emailrevealer.com. You can go to emailrevealer.com and get a copy of my book, How to Become a Successful Private Investigator. You also do all the kind of different services for you. Online dating service investigations called an online infidelity investigation. And that's where you give us your husband or your boyfriend, your girlfriend's email address, and we trace it back to their online dating websites. And we return a list of all the dating sites that email is registered to. We can expand on that investigation and trace it back to porn sites, escort service sites, swinger sites, gambling websites, and even prescription drug websites, and all kinds of digital forensics, computer and cell phone digital forensics, where we can recover deleted content from an email or a hard drive and produce a report for you that you can use in court. That's emailrevealer.com, or you can contact me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com.
It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome back to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. We're here today with Professor Rick Spence from the University of Idaho, up there in Moscow, Idaho. It's interesting. The guy wrote these books about the Russian, Russian this and Russian that. He's up there in Moscow. Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence and the Occult, Trust No One, The Secret World of Sidney Riley, and Dr. Richard Spence here from University of Idaho. We're talking today about the anti-Semitism in World War II. So from my understanding is that the Germans were upset because of the way World War I ended. They blamed that on the Jews?
Well, yeah, they were upset. Yes, they were. I don't think upset quite sums that up. It depends on it. There's one. Before we go into that, though, there's one thing that I wanted to make clear at the beginning, and I did. You know, sometimes just like a phrase or a sentence, in other cases whole paragraphs, that are lifted out of that work and then sort of just scattered. The whole thing is they're just sort of scattered within the protocols. I mean, there are 300 odd separate little snippets. So the problem is that if somebody tells you protocols is just a forgery, or the other term is that it plagiarizes the other work, you get the impression that it's simply taking this other work, this thing called dialogues, and it's just rewriting. And that's not true. It's almost as if you put it in a blender. That's the best way I can put it. I mean, many of these snippets, it's very clear that whoever wrote the protocols probably had some copy of the dialogue. The way in which they're incorporating this makes no particular sense, and it's only a small portion of it. And to me, it's a combination of anti-Masonic works that had come out. There's a certain element, Mars and work, arguing that the Jews were not really Germans or were somehow in German or European society. That kind of works in a way. But it was basically sort of building on the popular idea at the time, sort of popular conspiracy theory, that there was somebody who was plotting to rule the world. There's always somebody plotting to rule the world. And now we're going to sort of construct this all-around conspiracy template, which you can attach Masons, Jews, or whoever you would want, and that's what it tends to settle on. But the clear purpose of it, let's get back to what the purpose of the protocols were. The purpose of the protocols, as it developed, was used as yet another thing in the arsenal to argue. What was the argument? That Jews were a dangerous, corrosive element within society who were plotting to take it over and impose their control. So remember, they go from just being something that's alien, now something that's dangerous because they're trying to take over the world and rule us. And all of these things sort of combine together. And that does have to do with framing the kind of future mindset of the Nazis. I mean, the Nazis don't invent anything. There's nothing in Nazi anti-Semitism that's really new. It's simply a recycling and repackaging of things that had been previous. Remember the term we started with, anti-Semitism, keep bringing up?
Yes.
It comes down to what the term means. Okay, so I go back again. Marr invented anti-Semitism. He made it up as a replacement for Jew, which he thought was just too crude. But here's the point that I want to make clear. Anti-Semitism exclusively refers to opposition to Jews and Jews only. It doesn't, because, Semites embrace a larger group of people. Nobody ever uses the term anti-Semitism to say because they don't like Arabs or Assyrians or Maltese. All right. So the thing about it, in which often it's one of those things that on the first day in class I teach on anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, I make clear, I go, look, we're gonna keep, but let's just be aware of what we're really talking about. It's anti-Jew. That's the only thing it is. And in a way, it's kind of a, I have to admit, I almost find that there's something kind of weasel wordy about using this term. We all know what it means. Nobody's actually going to come out and say it directly. And I also find it kind of ironic that we're using a term which is invented by an anti-Semite to essentially sort of obscure or make better sound Jew hate, which is still basically what it is. So that's one of the things I want everybody out there to remember, is that whenever you hear the term anti-Semitism, it just means anti-Jew. And that's the only thing that it has ever meant, and that's what it was invented to obscure. So let's then go into, what the Germans were upset about they lost World War I. So, but it goes back, remember Germany had only been unified in 1870. And they were very proud of the country. Germans still are for all along, but it was a very different world. And that's sometimes the thing you have to wonder when you go back in time. So, in 1913, the two great tragedies of the modern era, the First and Second World Wars, which really create the whole world that we're in, and most of the assorted problems, those hadn't happened. And therefore, one of the things to keep in mind is that the German Empire, the Kaiser's Empire of 1913, was seen as a modern, productive country of engineers and scientists and intellectuals, and it carried none of the baggage it carries today. The two world wars, and especially the Second World War, which certainly, I think, marked the reputation and the whole identity of Germans, had occurred. So it was a different kind of mindset. So the Germans were exceedingly proud of themselves, and they entered into the war with the British and the French and the Russian empires, and they lost. Put up a hell of a fight, might add, but they lost. And this was a huge shock. And these were people. This was one of those things that was not supposed to have happened. And it was also a tremendous sacrifice. And in the result of that, you get all of this finger. And then the finger pointing after November 1918 was, well, who lost the war? Whose fault was it? And the basic fault was that you were taking on too many enemies, and that your military and political leadership who got you into the war in the first place failed. That's what the problem was. But remember, political and military establishments like those French High Command and the Dreyfus never admit they're wrong. So you have to look for somebody else to. So on the German right, on the sort of more conservative or old, the traditional kind of monarchist part of it, of end of the spectrum, they had an explanation for what had gone wrong. And what had gone wrong, their argument, was that Germany had lost the war because it betrayed from, and that there had been traitors represented on the German political left, parties like the socialists, parties, Communist Party would emerge. But essentially it's this kind of left-right argument in German politics. And by the way, there were Jews on both sides of the question. There were Jews that were prominent in both sides. But the one place that you can see them. So this is what happens in Germany at the end of the war. The army loses the war, and there is, but at the same time, there is not a surrender. Yeah, this is something else to keep in mind about World War I. Germany doesn't surrender. It signs a ceasefire on very disadvantageous terms. It signs a ceasefire. Hence the later argument, Germany was never truly defeated. And it should be noted that the Allied armies never invade German territory. When the war ended or when this ceasefire, the armistice comes in on the 11th of November 1918, German armies are intact. They still occupy much of Western Russia, which they had defeated. This is something else to keep in mind. The Germans actually win half of World War I. They win the war on the Eastern Front, partly by subsidizing revolution in Russia, But they defeat Tsarist Russia. They cause its collapse. They bring the Bolsheviks in power, in a sense. They then force a treaty on that, and they occupy the Ukraine, Baltic states. They occupy huge areas and win the war in the Eastern Front. They lose the war in the West. So there again, you can see why they're kind of frustrated. We won half the war. Why didn't we win all of it? So what happens then is that simultaneously with this armistice, there's a revolution in Germany, political revolution, and as a result of that, Kaiser, head of the monarchy, abdicates the throne and flees, and you then have the creation of what's called the Weimar Republic. So Germany goes from being monarchy to a republic. And party that dominates that republic, all of the key figures in the German Revolution are socialists. So what is basically established in Germany at the same time the war is over with is a revolution which brings in a socialist government that initially is, almost kind of quasi-Bolshevik. There was always that question as to whether it would go in the whole direction that you had in Russia at the time. And that's going to take months to work out. So there's this political turmoil in Germany. So the German right, that is those Germans who had supported the Kaiser and the monarchy, and as they saw traditional German politics and life, those people are the ones that are the most upset, and they believe they've been betrayed by the leftists who lost the war so they could bring themselves in power. See how that, you might logically come to that conclusion? All right, Germany lost the war. Who benefited from that? Well, the German left, the German socialists. And how can we prove that? Because now they're running the government. So what we think is they sabotaged the war effort in order to seize power. All right. Now, where do Jews come into this? Well, many of the prominent leaders of the German left were Jews in a very nominal sense. Remember, these were people who were Marxists, and if you're a good Marxist, you basically argue that things like religion are a kind of useless opiate of the people. And there were many German Jews and others who were attracted to Marxism. But here's the reason why. Okay, it's one of these questions that come up. Well, why are there so many Jewish communists? Okay, why are there so many Jewish Bolsheviks, etc.? Well, here's a simple reason. They were people who didn't want to be Jews anymore, for the most part. They're apostates. If you join a political movement which denies the legitimacy of any religion, which argues that they are all, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, equally pointless, and if you join a movement, as you did if you became a good doctrinaire Marxist that argued the only thing that is social class, what class you belong to, and even national identity is unimportant. Remember, Marxism basically expressed the goal of communism, for instance, and even socialism before it, was to unify the working class, regardless of any kind. Religion didn't figure into that. Nationalism didn't figure into it. And therefore, one of the appeals, one of the reasons why you tend to find lots of people of Jewish origin entering into Marxist movements is because it seems clear enough to me, it was a way for them to essentially jettison their whole Jewish identity. And therefore, the whole concept of a Jewish Marxist revolutionary is a kind of oxymoron. You can't actually be a Jew in any sense and a Marxist revolutionary, because being a Marxist revolutionary means you must repudiate every single thing about it that would make you Jewish. So it's this again is this, the divisions that always exist and how you would define it. So the German socialists of Jewish origins who didn't see themselves as Jews or who saw themselves as socialists, nonetheless are still recognizable as Jews to those on the German right. And so when they look, they see this subversion of the country country was betrayed so the socialists could come to power. And who are many of the prominent leaders of the socialists? Well, they're people who are Jews, and therefore this must in some way be Jewish. Then you read, somebody shows them a copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and it goes, hey, look at this.
Right.
It's a blueprint for Jewish world control. This is just, that's what's going on. See, one of the things about the protocols, you could argue, is that if you wanted to rule the world, it's not a bad, template. It actually describes, like gaining control of, say, how would we do this? Well, let's see. Let's gain control of banks, and then let's gain control of the media, and then let's gain control of education. That's what you would need to do. I mean, and so the actual process it describes, well, a little simpler than it sounds, isn't illogical. And in fact, it's kind of eerily possible. And then when someone in Germany in 1918 or after the war would try to figure out why this horrible disaster had befallen us, people want explanations. And one of those explanations that comes up, well, what happened here is that we now have a socialist conspiracy, which is really a Jewish conspiracy, which is somehow linked to these, which was outlined in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So what we're fighting here isn't socialism, it's Judaism. Some kind of Or what the term the Nazis always liked. You have to watch how they use this term, Judeo-Bolshevik. See, one of the ideas of the Nazis was that Bolshevism, that communism, was something that was invented by Jews, even though communism is incompatible with Judaism in any kind of philosophical sense. That's not really what they're interested in as well. And that's even weirder because the Nazis themselves are a variant of socialism. See, this is one of those little things that tends to get glossed over. And one of the things that you come up with – okay, here's the way it's generally – I've talked about that in Germany after the war you had this division between the right and the left. The left in Germany was basically represented by the socialist parties, which meant, the mainstream socialist party weren't quite as radical, and then the outgrowth from them party, which was much more radical and which wanted to turn Germany into another version of Bolshevik Russia. The German right, usually the Nazis, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which is, remember, the full name, are said to be part of the German right. They're not the same part of the German right that wanted to restore the Kaiser. Because the one thing that Hitler and his buddies had absolutely no intention of doing was restoring the Kaiser. They're not monarchists. In fact, they hate the monarchy, and they have no interest in restoring the traditional order. So you actually get sort of three different groups after the First World War. You've got the left, socialists and communists, who, by the way, don't get along and are constantly fighting each other because the communists want to replace the socialists and the socialists don't like the communists. So they're fighting each other. And then on the right, or the so-called right, you've got the kind of old right and the new right. The old right are the people who want to bring back Kaiser Bill. That's what they want. They want to restore traditional German monarchy. And then you've got this new bunch who coalesce around the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Now, if you didn't know better and somebody said, hey, there's this political party over here called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, you'd pretty much think that was a leftist party, wouldn't you?
Yeah, right. And that's what some people say today, yeah.
Yeah, Workers' Party, Socialist Workers' Party. Okay, well, that sounds pretty pinko to me.
There you go.
You would definitely think that was more towards the red end of the political spectrum than the other one.
Right. And
that's actually the way – it's one of the things that somebody can – it's always interesting to look at is that the Nazi Party early on, about when it had – initially it was just called the German Workers' Party. Then they had the National Socialist German Workers' Party. So they came up with a thing called the 25-point program. This is one of those things that anybody can go out and Google and you can look at it. The 25-point program of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which was compiled around 1920, and which all the way through 1945 was the official program of the party. And if you go through and read that, you see in those 25-point program, the two things I would say you notice is that, one, there's almost no mention of Jews. All right? There's some mention, but the main mention is that we don't believe that Jews are actually Germans, and therefore they can never be citizens of the German Reich. That's the main thing. That's about the only place it really comes up, is that Jews are aliens. We don't accept them as being Germans, and therefore they can't be citizens. But what most of this 25-point program is concerned with are things like nationalization, confiscation of war profits, massive expansion of the social welfare program. In fact, it is, in essence, a socialist economic program, which fits exactly with what their name is. So the difference here is that what the Nazis were claiming is that they were national socialists as opposed to international socialists.
Ah, okay.
Right? Okay, that's why that term national is in.
Gotcha, okay.
And what it basically meant is their argument is that, well, okay, the Bolsheviks in Russia are international socialists because they want to create a world socialist state in which nationality will be extinct, in which the working class, regardless of ethnicity, will be combined into a single great world socialist working class confederation. We're national socialists because what we want to do is to build a socialist society just Germans in Germany. So international socialism wants to essentially rule the world. We simply want to rule Germany, but we largely pursue. So just as if the German left was split between the feuding socialists and communists, the German right is split between the sort of old-style monarchists and these new national socialists. And eventually what happens is that Hitler and his crew are more successful in convincing much of the old right, they'll get more of their interest if they cooperate with us. He's able to make some kind of deal with them, whereas on the left, the socialists and communists never agree. And that's one of the reasons why the Nazis will succeed, is that there is no unity against them on the other side of the spectrum. And also because one of the things that they can do, this is what I often think people don't get, is that the Nazis are playing to the same, they're after the same that the communists are, which is the German working class, which is the biggest social group in Germany. So half the German population are working class. That's where most of your voters are. So one of the things that Hitler understands is that, if you want to win elections, which is how he comes to power, remember, not by seizing power, by being elected, by gaining seats in the Reichstag, making him so important that he gets to become chancellor, that the way you do it is you have to go where the votes are, and that means that you have to appeal to the biggest block of voters, and that is the working class. And then you throw in things for the lower middle class. But the Nazis are constantly, they soak the rich campaigns. I mean, their whole idea was that, yes, and see, that's something else they could come into. There were many conspicuously wealthy and important German Jews in industry, all right? And therefore, you could argue that, see, we're fighting. We as National Socialists are battling against the evil, heretical International Socialists, and we are also battling against the capitalists at home. And then they would turn around and point out, well, if you tend to look at the higher ranks of capitalists, bankers, and industrialists, and then you look at important figures in Russia, who is prominently displayed in both of those groups? Yes, Jews. All right, there you go. So in Russia, Trotsky, a Jew, at least in origin, is one of the key figures there. And then when we look in Germany, we find people like Warburg banking family, which is one of the most important financial institutions. Now, it's not one of those things that holds up close scrutiny. I mean, you can go through and sort of pick this apart. But remember, we're talking about political things. And, the only thing I would suggest, I think most people out there probably have seen political ads on television, and I guess the thing I can say, you ever notice how stupid they are? Okay, how they just appeal to the most base instincts in people.
And make America great again,
Right,
Pretty simple slogan, yeah.
Okay. Political slogans aren't really designed. Okay, they're designed to appeal to the broadest section of the electorate, which means you don't make things complicated. Generally, what you do, you make them as negative as possible. I mean, that's why negative political ads work, because people will much more better figure out what it is they're told that they're not supposed to like as of what they're supposed to. You know, it's easier for human beings to figure out what they don't want than what they want. Okay, try that the next time that you're really hungry and you're trying to decide where to go to. All right. Okay. Every suggestion isn't what you want until someone. So, you know, political campaigning, modern political campaigning, it always tends to go towards the lowest common denominator, and it heads towards personal attacks and smear tactics. And that's exactly what it was that Nazis capitalized on. They positioned themselves as the party that opposed the fat cats and the commies, and then they would point out that among the fat cats and the commies, the common denominator were Jews, and this became something sort of easy to build an opposition on. And that, in some ways, is, you know, how. And then, of course, they needed an economic crisis to make things even further. Another little detail, if people interested, the Nazis really get nowhere in Germany until the Depression comes along. All right? I mean, really, they don't get much of anywhere. If you go, you know, the Nazi Party is formed in, you know, 1919, 1920. Hitler becomes the key figure in it by 1921, 1922. But if you look at the elections in the Weimar Republic during that period, all the way up until really the elections of 1930, the Nazis don't do much. They're a fringe party. Nobody would ever take them seriously. But when the Depression comes along, and then you end up with, in Germany at its peak, a 30 to 40% unemployment rate. Think about that. That's where suddenly the Nazis take off. And they do it in a very simple reason. They simply argue that all of the other political parties have failed, and therefore you need to try something new, and we're something new. And the voters respond. All right? Don't vote for the socialists or the center party or the old right-wing parties anymore, because clearly they screwed things up. All the problems you have now are the fault of these people, so you should vote for us. We're something new. And that's, you know, oversimplifying it a bit, that's how Hitler gets into power. Also by making sweetheart deals of, you know, capitalists that he was criticized. I mean, one of the things he figured out early on was that you really needed industrialist money. You know, political campaigns cost a lot of money, and, you know, maintaining a private army of brown shirts costs a lot of money, and the people who can supply that are people with a lot of money. And that means that he then made deals with industrialists, and he made deals with the old monarchist army officers. It's something that people who you know, sort of students of World War II sometimes note that Hitler was always at odds with most of his officers. He didn't quite trust his army.
Right.
Who were, by the way, the guys that were constantly trying to kill him. I mean, you know, in 1944, who was it who tried to blow up Hitler? It was the army. And they had repeatedly tried to assassinate him even before that. And the reason for this is that the German army, all the way through to the very bitter end, was primarily monarchist. I mean, what they wanted to do, these were guys who often went back to World War I, and they wanted to bring back the Kaiser. And they just sort of accepted Hitler because he was the fellow who would facilitate he would rebuild the army and, you know, restore them to their position of greatness. But they don't ever particularly like him. I mean, they tend to think he is a gutter. You know, he's a kind of crass popular politician who they need to get the political support in order to rearm. But other than that, they don't like or trust him, and he never likes and trusts them because he knows that they're not really on the same side. They'd much rather have Kaiser Bill back on the throne, have Adolf there, and so he sort of continually purges the army. Goes along. So it's, you know, the thing that from the or from Nazi political propaganda, the thing that Jews become very useful for as scapegoats And one of the reasons they tend to fit that role well is that you can see them in different, you can turn them into, you can argue that, Jews are Bolsheviks. No, Jews are capitalists, or they're, they can be sort of put into any particular category you want them into, and they can then be, and they don't quite fit in. There's this whole question as to whether or not Jews, whether it was a German Jew, or think of it another way, a Jewish German. Here's the question. I am a Jew living in Germany, late 19th, early 20th century, and here comes back to this question. What am I? Am I a German Jew, which means that primarily I'm a Jew, but then I'm also a German? Or am I a Jewish German? Am I a German, and, which is the noun and which is the adjective? Which is the primary identity and which is the thing that modifies that identity? So remember, being a German Jew and a Jewish German are not exactly the same thing. They really are different ways of imagining yourself and different ways of defining yourself. And what the Nazis were very firm about all the way back to their original 25-point program was that Jews are not Germans and never can be. Although that's not true, because even Hitler would make honorary Aryans out of Jews that he decided he wanted to make honorary Aryans out of. That's one of the interesting things, is that there were Jews in relatively influential positions.
How much of Hitler's motivation was to create this Aryan master race of blue-eyed, blonde-haired, and that was one reason for excluding the Jews?
Well, that would work if you assume that no Jews were blonde-haired and blue-eyed. Here's an interesting survey that was actually made in the 1920s. To what degree was there a difference between the incidence of blonde hair and blue eyes in the general German population and among Jewish Germans or German Jews? You know what they found out? They're exactly the same. And you sort of figure that because these people have been living there. I mean, physically, there's almost no real distinction between Jewish Germans and non-Jewish Germans. They all pretty much look alike. And that therefore but then the other thing is that go look at a picture of Hitler. Now, Hitler has blue eyes. Does he have blonde hair?
Right.
No, I mean, is he an epitome of the perfect blonde, blue-eyed Aryan? No, not at all. He doesn't fit the picture at all. In fact, if you sort of, and most of the other Nazi leaders, Himmler, Hess, and then look at the kind of idealized Nazi propaganda posters of all the kind of strong, German, usually fair-haired men and women, these kind of heroic figures. And then look at Hermann Goering and Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler, and notice the fact, by comparison, they're pretty weedy specimens. None of them fit this kind of model they would have. So it's an invention. It's a fantasy. I mean, they invent these sort of this fantasy image of what people, but it's advertising in the same way that advertising is constantly putting forward this fantasy image of what people are supposed to look like, and real people don't look that way. All right. And it's, it's something I think that, put it this way, that any female listeners will be able to identify with, the kind of model perfect beauty of female image of what ideal advertisers' idea of what the ideal woman is supposed to be, and then what real women look like. One of the things is that those things are just not true. So Nazism is based upon this kind of fantasy image. The Nazi leaders don't really hold up to that. Can't actually make any. There's no huge physical distinction between blue eyes and blonde hair, and those weren't the absolute necessary prerequisites to be a member of the party. They were kind of idealized features, but those features are as prominent among the Jews as they are elsewhere. There's not really any kind of distinction. And one of the things is that the great irony in this to me often is that, again, if you go back before the First World War, the Jewish population in Germany is probably one of the most assimilated and successful in Europe. I think far more. I mean, about the only other place would be. Does that mean that there wasn't a kind of underlying suspicion? There's a fair amount of that. If there wasn't, some kind of, there was that kind of question hanging over them. But for the most part, they were quite well accepted. Or at least there was no area of German society or commerce, even into the nobility, in which Jews in the late 19th century were not accepted into. Now, that acceptance might have been a certain amount of reluctance, but they're not excluded.
And now a word from our sponsors. Check out cartking.com, 877-986-7771. Have you ever thought about opening your own mobile cart or kiosk business? Perhaps your current business wants to add multiple point-of-sale locations across the country quickly. Maybe the facility you manage could kickstart revenue by adding coffee, food, or retail services, like let's say you own an office building or a warehouse. Put one of these carts there in the lobby. Well, CartKing.com can be the answer to your needs. CartKing.com is a North American designer and manufacturer of the finest mobile retail coffee and food carts and kiosks money can buy. For 20 years, CartKing.com has been working with clients and corporations across America to provide indoor and outdoor carts and kiosks for any application. From large, heated, and secure outdoor retail or food kiosks to smaller, more mobile coffee kiosks or coffee stations, coffee carts, CartKing.com designs and builds them all. Carts and kiosks are fun, and so are the dozens of designs on the website, CartKing.com. Please visit today at CartKing.com or just call them at 877-986-7771. Tell them Ed Opperman sent you and you get a good deal. When they started, rounding up, Jews and making them wear Star of David, and, the star and stuff, was this widely accepted by the population?
Well, here's one of the things you have to look at if you actually look, once the Nazis are in power, what do they start? All right. Well, initially, all they control is Germany. All right. So this is before the war. So 1933, from Hitler comes to power, until 1939, when World War II starts, for 6 years, relatively short period of time, what you have is that during that period, what the Nazis control is Germany, and then during that period, a couple of areas they annex to it, like Austria, okay, the other German, which is also German-speaking German state that Hitler was from. Remember, Hitler is not a Reich German. He's not from Germany. He's an Austro-German from next door, ethnic German from what was originally the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then which became the small Republic of Austria. So he's technically an immigrant into the rest, and was not, by the way, a German citizen throughout most of the 1920s. So they control a limited area with a relatively small Jewish population. So what do? So what some people imagine is this power, they start erecting concentration camps and they arrest all the Jews and throw them into it and start killing. No, they don't. They don't kill anybody. They do create concentration camps. The first one in place, by the way, Dachau, and these were special prisons outside cities. But who they throw in there are political enemies, communists, some of them are Jews, okay, socialists, members of the Catholic Center Party,
homosexuals,
members of religious groups who don't go on. But they're
right.
The concentration camps are for political enemies. And if you're a Jew that ends up in a concentration camp period, you didn't end up there because you were a Jew. You ended up there possibly because you were a communist. Now, being a Jew didn't help, but that wasn't the reason. There was no law in that period that allowed you to be arrested. So during that 6 years, what the Nazis do in Europe is they simply begin to tighten the economic and social screws on Jews. They argued that we don't want Jews here. We want to rid Germany of Jews, and the way we're going to do it is we're just going to make it impossible for them to earn a living, and they'll have to go elsewhere. And they do that quite successfully. So in 1933, again, there are about 500,000 Jews in Germany in 1933. In 6 years, that number has been cut down to around 200,000. So what happens is that simply through economic restrictions and social restrictions, a whole bevy of things, like, if you're a Jewish doctor, there's a law passed that says you can't treat anything other than Jewish patients. Now imagine how that's going to work. Remember, 1% of the population, that means that almost all of you're now legally restricted from treating any who aren't Jews. If you're a Jewish lawyer, you're suddenly then restricted from having any clients who are other than Jews, and you can't work. You can no longer appear in court. You can't represent your clients. There's no way you can do that. Then they begin confiscating businesses. They Aryanize their business. They come in and argue that you have to transfer ownership. The ownership of every corporation must have a majority membership of Aryans, which means non-Jews, and so you're going to have to sell off your company, or you're going to have control of it. And what happens is that Jews leave Germany and then later Austria by the tens of thousands, by the hundreds of thousands. So in a sense, what it was that Hitler declared that he wanted was to rid Jews from Germany. He essentially had succeeded in doing, or was well on his way to doing, simply by economic pressure. So there aren't any death camps in this period. The one large outgrowth you had. Now, and by the way, I'm not saying this to argue that the Nazis were being benevolent. Not at all. They are being as absolutely ruthless and insidious as they can. The point is that they don't start out murdering people. They simply start out making life unlivable, unbearable for them, and they leave. They could have achieved their ends in exactly that way.
But was the average German, were they tolerant of this, or were they objecting to this?
Well, there were objections, but that was the type of thing that would get you arrested.
Right.
What most people did is what most people do under any circumstances. They go about their business. They don't pay much attention to it. It didn't concern them. And the other thing, keep in mind, is that one of the things that Hitler was promising, remember, what brought the Nazis, what made the Nazis a major party to begin with? An economic class, mass. And what Hitler begins, one of the things the Nazis sort of become famous for, among other things, was introducing massive make-work programs. Kind of like what FDR did here. You put people to work. What do? You put people to work building autobahns. And so this is what the average German noticed. What they noticed is that after the Nazis came to power in 1933, economically things got better. Now, the real reason why things were getting better didn't have to do with Nazi policies. It had to do with the fact that every economic downturn will bottom out and then will go back. Okay, everything is a wave. And that's something that Hitler understood. Hitler could bring in and it's something FDR understood, and Mussolini understood, and Stalin understood. Every politician understood. That what you do is that, it's like a flood, right? The river overflows its banks and it floods everything, and people are horrified and terrified. But what happens afterwards? The waters recede. That will always happen. An economy will recover largely on its own. But what you as a politician have to appear to do is that you have to be the magician which is making this happen. And therefore, the Depression bottomed out, the German economy recovered, the Nazi policies in some cases helped that, in other cases they might have delayed it. Mostly they didn't make a difference one way or the other, but the Nazis get the credit. So a couple of years later, in 1935, prosperity is returned. And then things continue to get better in 36 and 37 and 38. So here's one of the things that I would say with absolute confidence, that is that if in 1930 or even in early 1939, there had been a fair election in Nazi Germany as to whether or not Hitler would be reaffirmed as leader, he would have won overwhelmingly. He wouldn't have gotten everybody's vote. There was plenty of Germans who hated him. There was still an underground communist party, but he would have won overwhelmingly for the simple reason under the Nazi rule, life had gotten better.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's really hard to fight with. Things, it's a simple question. Are you better off now than you were before? And what the vast majority of Germans would say, we're better off now. Now, in the process of things getting better for most, so remember what percentage of the population Jews were? Less than 1%. So nobody's paying much attention to them. And by the way, not only Jews were less than 1% of the population, but all of them lived in large cities. Here's something. A third of all those Jews lived in Berlin, one town. 1 out of every 3 Jews, less than 1% of the population, live in one city, which means that most Germans who lived in small towns or villages, there weren't any Jews around.
I never met one, yeah.
Yeah, well, maybe they'd met one, but they didn't know them. They weren't friends. They weren't close to them, and they didn't see any of this stuff happen.
Mm-hmm.
So the Jews that were being financially ruined and forced to leave the country were basically leaving the larger cities, where, by the way, that generally worked to the advantage of some people because, if this lawyer or this doctor or this business disappears, well, I'm getting rid of a competitor, aren't I?
Right.
So, the simple reason why most Germans didn't complain is that, one, it didn't affect them. They were otherwise benefiting from a situation, and they, for the most part, really didn't know anybody who was being terribly harmed by it. And after all, these are people who were never really Germans to begin with. Nobody's being killed. They're just going somewhere else.
We only have about 10 minutes left. Is it possible that we could see a reoccurrence of this kind of thing?
Well, what kind of thing specifically? I mean, a reoccurrence of blaming the Jews for everything?
Yeah, because if you look around now, it's getting pretty scary. I'm 55 years old. I didn't see this 20 years or 25 years ago to this extent.
Well, I tell you, one of the things that I think is happening, I mean, one of the things that happens in history is like a play which is constantly rehearsed, but you're rewriting lines and you're changing costumes, but it's the same thing that's going on. So could Jews again in one place or another become a scapegoat for everything which is going wrong? Sure.
Yeah.
It's worked before. The other thing, though, that I think you're sensing, and I get some sense of this as well, is that what eventually, of course, the Nazi regime does once the war starts is it embarks upon a genocidal campaign to exterminate Jews, not in Germany, where they'd already gotten rid of most of them, but where do they set up the extermination camps? In Poland.
Mm.
It's the Polish Jews that are murdered in huge numbers, because that's where most of the population is. Here's the point I would make. There is no death camp per se. The Vernichtungslager, places like Treblinka and Sobibor and Auschwitz are all next door in Poland. They never set up one of those things in Germany. They set them up next door, and they transport Jews from Western Europe, even the remaining German Jews, and they murder them in Poland. They don't kill them in Germany. Because I think in a way they just didn't want to sort of contaminate the West with it. And it's the odd sort of things you can see. You get into these weird ironies that Western European Jews that the Nazis considered to be closer to them get transported in passenger cars to Auschwitz as opposed to freight cars. Now think about it. You're sending people to their death. You're sending them to a slaughterhouse, be processed. But simply because of the outward perception that these people are kind of look more like us than these people do, we're going to let these Dutch Jews travel in passenger cars in relative comfort, whereas we're going to take Polish Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto and we're going to cram them like cattle in cars where half of them will be dead before they reach the death. And then they're all in for the same thing.
Mm.
And it's just, one of the things that makes the study of any kind of history fascinating is just what the hell is going on. I mean, you can just look at this and elsewhere and just sometimes come to the conclusion that human beings are just as a species nuts.
Mm. It's so true.
And that history is just this people doing just completely insane things. So you can explain it to a degree, but in the end, it's like this idea about who am I or who are these people? It's just these ideas that get into people's heads. It's just this fixation that people have. But what's happened is that the Holocaust was such a huge, it was such an ugly, nasty business that it was so difficult to ignore. This is what's happened. It's fading. Because fewer and fewer people have any connection. And there's this point in anything that happens in history when something is a history that alive actually remembers, and then it becomes something that you only read about in a book. And when that happens, it begins to change. And I think what you simply have is you have increasingly generations of people who are further and further removed from those events, and they really don't have any direct meaning. And that means that one of the things that happens is that things that were, let's say, verboten, use that word, that would have been unacceptable in the 1950s or 1960s, when there was still the memory of World War II was fairly fresh. Memory is fading, and it is becoming something else. And therefore, the old ideas, the old prejudices and fears and hatreds and suspicions, they never go away. They just wait around. They're like a virus. Does that make any sense? And they just wait to break out again.
Oh, boy. I can't thank you enough. Once again, it's just like I would love to be up there and be able to take your class. In the next couple of minutes, what do you want to leave us with, and how can people get a hold of you? How can they find your books and stuff?
Okay, well, again, if you're interested more about me, if you want to look at if you're interested in coming to the University of Idaho, for instance, or you think somebody might be, uidaho.edu or simply University of Idaho, and then you can find the page for the Department of History. And you can look at my CV and some other examples of my work. A number of things. I've done other interviews that are many of which are rumored to be available on YouTube. Some articles that also can be found out on the web. So, Google me and see what you come up with. Remember, I'm Richard Spence. I'm not Richard Spencer. I want to make that absolutely clear. Two entirely different people. Who you would want to look for. My books are available on Amazon, and there are other people that sell books but Amazon, but does anybody notice that anymore? Or in bookstores. And so, yes, I'd plug Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, 1905 to 1925, which touches upon a lot of the things we've talked about today. Also, The Secret World of Sidney Riley, Trust No One. Then Secret Agent 666, which is Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence, and the Occult. And I would throw in one more that I co-authored with a fellow by the name of Walter Bosley, which is called Empire of the Wheel, specifically Volume 1. That was the one I was the co-author of, which is a kind of true crime, occult murder mystery story set in old Southern California. It was an interesting tale as well.
Well, I got to check that one. It's a different type of venue there. Professor Spence, thank you so much.
Okay.
Good night.
Bye.
Okay, we'll be right back after these quick messages, a little wrap-up here. But thank you so much, Professor Richard Spence, University of Idaho. Check out our previous interviews we did about Aleister Crowley, 666. What is that? A Secret Agent 666. Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence, and the Occult. And we have that there on YouTube and Spreaker and all that kind of stuff. And now a word from our sponsors. Check out cartking.com, 877-986-7771. Have you ever thought about opening your own mobile cart or kiosk business? Perhaps your current business wants to add multiple point-of-sale locations across the country quickly. Maybe the facility you manage could kickstart revenue by adding coffee, food, or retail services, like let's say you own an office building or a warehouse. Put one of these carts there in the lobby. Well, CartKing.com can be the answer to your needs. CartKing.com is a North American designer and manufacturer of the finest mobile retail coffee and food carts and kiosks money can buy. For 20 years, CartKing.com has been working with clients and corporations across America to provide indoor and outdoor carts and kiosks for any application. From large, heated, and secure outdoor retail or food kiosks to smaller, more mobile coffee kiosks or coffee stations, coffee carts, CartKing.com designs and builds them all. Carts and kiosks are fun, and so are the dozens of designs on the website, CartKing.com. Please visit today at CartKing.com or just call them at 877-986-7771. Tell them Ed Opperman sent you and you get a good deal. The Opperman Report is brought to you by SubhashTechnosis.com. Subash Technosis is a search engine optimization and website design company. They're located in India, so you know you're going to save a lot of money and get top quality service. They offer all sorts of business process outsourcing, data entry, banking BPO services, recruitment process outsourcing, software testing, offshoring, research network, customer care, press release, content writing, and distribution, and much, much more. Now, you can get a hold of Subash Technosis by email at info@subhashtechnosis.com. Their website is www.subhashtechnosis.com, and their Skype is ANUSHASUBASH. Remember, all these shows on Awake are brought to you by emailrevealer.com. You can go to emailrevealer.com and get a copy of my book, How to Become a Successful Private Investigator. You also do all the kind of different services for you. Online dating service investigations called an online infidelity investigation. And that's where you give us your husband or your boyfriend, your girlfriend's email address, and we trace it back to their online dating websites. And we return a list of all the dating sites that email is registered to. We can expand on that investigation and trace it back to porn sites, escort service sites, swinger sites, gambling websites, and even prescription drug websites, and all kinds of digital forensics, computer and cell phone digital forensics, where we can recover deleted content from an email or a hard drive and produce a report for you that you can use in court. That's emailrevealer.com, or you can contact me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com.